Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Assessment in the Age of the Algorithm webinar. I'm Alan Bourne, CEO at Sova.
And I'm Jarrett Hardy, the Chief Technology Officer at Sova.
And we're looking forward to discussing this topic with you this morning. I'm just going to firstly kick off with a bit of background. So just to introduce myself, I've worked in the field for about 20 years or so, previously at providers such as SHL and Talent Q, and then started Sova about 4 years ago, specialising in tailored and blended assessments. And we've been focusing lately on how we introduce AI in a responsible way into assessment, and want to kind of spend some time with you talking about what that involves and what it looks like from your perspective.
And I have worked in technology across a number of industries, including professional services over the years. I've also worked for some large internet service providers out of Silicon Valley, and I'm really excited about what we can bring to the table in artificial intelligence now that the technology is reaching a level of maturity that it can be applied to industries such as ours.
Okay, thank you. And so just briefly about how we work, our focus is really combining what we know from psychometrics and psychological science with innovating new technology and bringing these two things together, and doing so in a way that's fit for the digital context which organisations are facing, and particularly the rapid rate of change which people are trying to adapt to. So just to give you a bit of background about our approach. On that note, let's just pause for a moment and consider the legacy of assessment as it currently stands, and therefore this will lead us into what we might be able to do in the future. So traditionally, assessment often gets applied in a relatively fragmented way. For example, in a volume hiring process, you might have a number of different psychometric tools being used in a screening stage. You may have telephone or video interviewing then happening after that to shortlist candidates, and you may then have paper-based interviews or assessment centres. So some of that may be sort of, Internet 1.0 and assessment 1.0. Some of that may be still on paper and very analog, in quite a fragmented process. Some of the status quo that leaves us with is a lack of personalisation and a lot of off-the-shelf approaches going on. Often the end-to-end process is quite poorly integrated and has quite a lot of inefficiencies within it. And that fragmentation of data means that we're not necessarily getting as much value out of what we are doing in assessment processes as we could be. And where the AI bit then comes in is how we can really leverage the data. Getting the data joined up is quite a key part of doing that. So there are a number of foundation areas that are part of this story, as well as the very interesting potential that's ahead of us.
So I wanted to start off a little bit by talking about what we mean when we're talking about artificial intelligence. Obviously, it's the buzzword of the year. Everybody is talking about it, and it's coming up in some fairly strange contexts sometimes. So it's a little hard to sort of wrap your head around what it actually is. There really isn't an accepted definition, to be honest. It is a very broad term. For some people, it means self-driving cars. For others, it means identifying cancer cells, and for still others, it means surveillance capitalism. We are well familiar with how Google is using artificial intelligence, for example. So there isn't really a commonly accepted definition, but I think the point of artificial intelligence is that it isn't about doing things that humans cannot do. It's about replicating what humans do on a different scale or with a different speed. We're going to be talking today primarily about machine learning, which I think is probably the flavor of artificial intelligence that's most relevant for assessment. And machine learning, although it is also a bit of a nebulous topic, really covers two things: categorization. So how can we, identify something? Is this a face that we're looking at, for example, or a cancer cell? And prediction, looking at what we have historically known with our data can we predict what's going to happen in the future? And that's probably the main concern for assessment, obviously. Now, we already do prediction in assessment, and we already use algorithms in assessment. So really, it's interesting to step back and kind of look at what machine learning and artificial intelligence adds to that equation. Since it's something that we're already kind of doing, what it gives us the power to do in assessment is to throw a lot of computing power at data that is located in different locations and harvest that information to increase the accuracy and fairness of our prediction models. So just to give you kind of an example from a different industry, there is a company in California called Incitro, and it is a pharmaceutical company that is using machine learning to reduce the time it takes to develop new medications and to increase the likelihood of success for those medications to actually cure the disease that they're targeting. It can take up to a decade to develop new medication, and Incitro is using machine learning to radically shorten that time period. Similarly, there's sort of an opportunity in assessment for us to take what we already do with our algorithms, with the prediction models that we have, and enhance them and greatly improve them, take them to sort of levels that we don't already have. And this is sort of the journey towards AI in assessment, as sort of Al was saying at the top of the call. We have seen technology creeping into the space, as it does in every industry, and we've gone from paper-based products, then enhanced by being online, then enhanced by being online and personalized, which is very much the circle that Sova inhabit, and finally where we are now moving, which is to enhance it further with machine learning. So at each sort of step in the history of assessment, we are using technology to sort of enhance what we are already doing and take it to a new level, and I think machine learning is really no different. I have a little slide here on what can go wrong in machine learning, and I think this is probably the nightmare scenario that all of us are worried about when we think about bringing in machine learning and artificial intelligence. All these algorithms are great, but we can see here that some early adopters have really stumbled. And it's interesting to kind of look at this and see where they went wrong. There's a lot of learning here. I think what we can say, particularly for some of these organizations like Google and possibly Amazon, is that this is what happens if you let the IT team loose on artificial intelligence and machine learning without any subject matter expertise alongside it. Machine learning is about training computers to do what humans already do. And if not properly supervised, in other words, if you just leave it to the technologists, you will train people on the worst of what humans already do. And so this is, I mean, these are very entertaining headlines, but this is very much what we're seeking to avoid. So this is following on from that, Sova's approach to artificial intelligence. We want to be sort of innovative, of course. There's a lot of opportunity, but we also want us to explore it responsibly and develop the products in a mature way that is going to be beneficial to candidates as well as to the hiring process. There's really a landscape in AI at the moment in our industry. There's, of course, obviously firms that aren't really doing much looking at machine learning. They're probably leaving a lot of opportunities on the table when they refuse to engage with the technology. And there are firms that are doing some fairly risky things with AI that are probably being a little bit more technology-led rather than psychology-led. So Sova is really trying to find that upper right quadrant, if you like, the sweet spot for adopting AI. And there's, frankly, a good reason for that. We feel that it is the most likely to succeed with the least amount of effort at this point and will drive the biggest business benefit. So if you look in the bottom right there, we can see that the technology for doing machine learning is basically here. It is available to anybody, as you can see on the far right. Amazon, for example, offers a whole suite of tools for doing the kind of machine learning and artificial intelligence that everybody is talking about these days. When you get to some aspects of machine learning, however, you are obviously going to be spending an awful lot of effort, a lot of money, and possibly not really reaping the greatest benefit, because there are aspects of the machine learning landscape that, although they are in production, probably aren't ready for prime time. Video analysis, for example, is one area where the science isn't quite ready yet. We can see that there are a lot of bias in the tools and the algorithms, and we definitely have to look at how accurate they are and how fair they are before we use them.
Okay, thank you, Jarrett, for giving us the outline there of what we mean by AI in this context. I'd now like to just take you through 5 key factors to consider when we are looking at probably any AI solution in the HR space, but particularly kind of when we're applying it to assessment. So the first point here is real world readiness. Is the technology, particular piece of technology we're looking at, ready to make a difference in a way that is going to be effective and won't get hacked easily, etc. in works. So the example that we'll hopefully run in a second gives you an illustration of a piece of work by Lab 6, who spend a lot of time trying to hack existing AI tools. So this is looking at Google's Inception V3 classification tool, which is one of its vision tools. If you were in a driverless car, this would be one of the things that's driving it for you. What they're showing is by creating a model of a turtle, which is what you can see in front of you, they've made it from thousands and thousands of tiny little rifle-shaped images, and I think we can all see it's definitely a model of a turtle. The computer is absolutely convinced that it is a rifle with 99% certainty. If you imagine that piece of equipment driving your car for you, and somebody had hacked this or put something on a road sign with this kind of formatting on, they could crash your car in a second. Yeah. So the point is, the technology is not safe yet in certain arenas. Yeah, and there are ways it could be. It might be safe in lots of contexts, but there are ways it can be hacked, and it would need to be proof to that to be rolled out in a safe way. That example in Lab 6 spend a lot of time doing these things, mainly to sort of prove the point and help us think about it, is something we can take away into our context, which is any technology we're using, is it going to deliver the outcomes that matter to us in a organization and HR context? One of those outcomes is always, can we predict things really well? Can we work out who the best performers are, etc.? And that's probably the first thing we're looking at. But other critical ones are, can we do so in a way that's inclusive? And most organizations will have different objectives they're trying to get to in terms of gender inclusivity, ethnicity, disability, neurodiversity, etc. And making sure that what we do meets those multiple requirements is really critical. The examples that we gave earlier from, for example, the Amazon CV screener, which was effectively being very sexist about how it scored candidates, was working on the basis that it used existing data on who got hired. Who got hired basically was laced with sexist decisions. Yeah? So the AI tool was doing a brilliant job of copying what people had done previously. What it wasn't doing was a better job, which is what was needed to work out who should get hired in a balanced and fair way. Yeah. So we're just sort of pointing out, step one, is the technology ready to do what we need it to? And then let's be optimistic about that, but also critical in a constructive way. Jarrett also mentioned earlier about supervised versus unsupervised learning. There's an example on the right here, which is actually quite an old one now, of Gary Kasparov, who was the world chess champion, playing against IBM's supercomputer. The first round of this, the computer, which had massively higher processing power than any human, still kept losing because he knew how to play chess really well intuitively. It was only when they trained the system using I think maybe the second best chess player in the world, that then the computer pretty much annihilated him in every game, which was, as you can see in the picture, pretty distressing for him. But it proved the point that if you can combine subject matter expertise about a particular area with the technology, you can get somewhere very quickly. If you just apply technology to a problem without really understanding what you already know about that problem, it can take a long time, or you can make some very big mistakes, as per our earlier slide. And the point really is there's no need to make those mistakes. If you've got experts in an area, then let's combine the expertise that already is with the technology and make the best of it, rather than just having a completely tech-led solution, which is missing out on that. I mentioned earlier about diversity and inclusion. I think it's quite essential that this is really baked into how we approach what we want from AI. Just like we would do with any assessment process, any AI tools that we might use, we should be looking at these factors as part of, does it work or not? And I think that's a critical point to draw out. The fourth point here, which follows from that, is the transparency and explainability. So one of the terms that I think is very relevant here is the difference between a black box and a glass box. I will just briefly say, you might have noticed my voice is a bit croaky, so do forgive me, but the black box approach is where you have an AI tool which might be using a range of different techniques. You're giving it an outcome to focus on, and it's building a model of how to predict that outcome. But in doing so, it may be very complex and very difficult to explain. Yeah, that becomes quite difficult if you are in a position of, let's say, having an employment tribunal trying to explain why one person got hired and somebody else didn't. The glass box approach is still using AI, but it is doing it in a way where the key elements of that decision making are very transparent. So it's able to illustrate what the key elements that drove to this kind of scoring of one individual kind of being selected and another one not being selected can be brought out and explained, both to in a legal context if needed, but more importantly, actually to candidates in the first instance, that they can accept that as reasonable and they know how it works. Yeah, and that's part of the social legitimacy of a solution. Yeah. And the fifth point here is again being careful what we look at, so being future oriented. So machine learning trains on data that you have already collected. Yeah, and you may then try and predict forward, but you can only do it on the data that you have. And as the example says here, if you drive looking in the rear view mirror, you will have some accidents. You won't get it right all the time. Yeah, there is no such thing as 100% perfect prediction, because the future will always be slightly different to the past. Yeah, so combining the analytics, which might hopefully draw on the data you have in the past, and very recently, with a forward-looking view of what capabilities your organization needs, is actually going to get you to the best solution. In that forward-looking piece, human expertise is critical. Yeah, so there is a role there to combine the two that's really, where the gold is, essentially, in this space. So the lesson here at this stage is to be careful what you wish for, to think about these different success criteria, and to be clear what you need and what you're looking for, to factor these elements in. And I think it's probably important to say that guardianship of good HR practice, just like all of the other things in HR, that sits with the HR function. Suppliers, technology firms, etc., internal digital teams are all there in the HR area to help you with that. But that responsibility and guardianship, really does sit with, the HR function, and that's something where owning and being clear about where you're trying to get to and what your requirements are is really key in through that driving the solutions that come to market into the industry. So in terms of how you might apply that, our recommendation is to kind of own that role seriously on the one hand, but clearly be enthusiastic and positive about what can be achieved. Don't feel shamed about sort of having to go with the flow. Be clear about what your needs are, and then it's up to technologists to work with you to get there, and to recognise the need for an ethical approach that's transparent, and to bring together what we know from a good practice and science-based perspective with technology, and that's going to give us the key to making rapid and impactful progress. If we move on to what Sova is doing now, I'll just hand over to Jarrett just to give a brief overview, and then we'll take you through a couple of examples.
Yeah, thank you. So Sova are, as I said earlier, already looking into how we can use machine learning. And in that context, we've combined technologists, such as myself and my team, with the psychology team. The ratio is definitely quite lopsided. There are far more psychologists actually on our machine learning efforts than there are technologists. And that is a deliberate attempt to introduce that expertise, as Al was mentioning earlier, but also to keep the balance very firmly centered on good HR practice and eliminating some of the bias that's already in the industry. So we have been working on building accurate and fair scoring algorithms using machine learning. If you want to think of it as SPSS on steroids, for those of you who are familiar with SPSS, it's not a bad analogy, frankly. It is about using the data in a constant feedback loop to analyze the success of the prediction and then tweak the algorithm on an ongoing basis at certain key points to make it fairer, but also to eliminate bias in real time, if possible, or to detect cases in a campaign where we might be straying into a bit of bias given the role being hired. We're also looking at ways that we can use video interview analysis, mostly of the spoken word, to speed up the screening and selection. We have a tool that we're in the process of finalizing that analyzes the content of the video interview to provide some predictive assistance in scoring to the hiring manager, who will then come along and evaluate the most likely successful candidates to make the final decision. And we're also using artificial intelligence to digitize the process of actually creating an assessment. And this has enormous benefits for efficiency and speed, reducing the time required to set up a new project to do some recruiting, but also makes the process a lot more inclusive by allowing you to sort of include far more people in consideration than you would if you were just conducting a one-on-one interview or a simple focus group.
Okay, so moving on to the first of those topics, around AI-driven fair and predictive profiling. If you think about what happens currently when profiling of candidates at scale is done well, there are typically two elements to that. One of them is ensuring that we are predicting who the high performers or high potential candidates are as accurately as possible. Typically that is done through some piloting or once a year validation analysis. And alongside that, there may be adverse impact analysis to ensure that's done as fairly as possible. The process that we've now got in place and are rolling out with some pioneer clients is to embed that as an ongoing machine learning-led process. So rather than it being an offline process that happens once a year or at the beginning of a rollout, this is actually just part of ongoing activity. So when a new assessment is created, it is tested against existing data sets to minimize adverse impact, ensure it's as fair as possible and as valid as possible before being switched on. And then from that point, as candidates start to come through a workflow, when individuals are hired, there are follow-up points with hiring managers, and typically 3 months seems to be quite a popular kind of timescale, but it can be 4, 12, 24 weeks, whatever sort of is going to land best, to then have a check-in on how is that individual who's joined performing, how engaged are they, how do we view them more widely in terms of readiness for promotion, for example, what impact are they having behaviourally, are they performing in line with our competencies or our values, and to be just checking in on that with some snap surveys on a rolling basis. That data set is then building up in real time as that data comes in and is used to optimize the scoring of all candidates that are earlier on in the process, from the perspective of both accuracy and fairness at the same time. And that machine learning process is key to turning some of the validation type models that have been traditional in assessment and turning them into a AI-driven process, which happens in real time and is actually much closer to the reality now. It will always need a forward view about what you need in the future that hasn't happened yet, but it means you will have a much more real-time analysis of what good looks like in making that come to life. One key point here, which related to something I said earlier on, in the assessment space, traditionally there have been solutions that might do one particular activity. There might be a psychometric tool that does one thing, or there might be a video interview that just does that. A platform-based approach, which means you have all of these data points together through the workflow, and that might be blended assessment, it could be video interview data, it could be face-to-face into final interview, digital assessment center, etc. We are able to look at all of the data points that have been gathered about the candidate during their application process and link that to who the high performers are, so that that model is much more comprehensive than merely looking at one or two particular data points coming in. So I think this is sort of a very exciting area in which we're rolling out machine learning to have a significant impact and deliver a lot of benefit for clients.
So as I mentioned earlier, we are also looking at how we can use machine learning to simplify and enhance the video interview process. We have looked extensively, of course, at the technology, the landscape of the technology in machine learning for videos is quite broad. Some of it is definitely not ready for prime time, but the aspect of a video interview that I think machine learning can most reliably enhance is the content of what the candidate has said. So by transcribing the response that a candidate has given to text, we can use the existing machine learning algorithms to sort of analyze that data and feed that through the algorithm process, measuring it up against scores that have been given by hiring managers, looking at the data alongside the assessment information and validation studies. This can be used both in two ways. This is what we're using it at Sova. One is obviously for the actual video interview process, and another is as part of the process of creating an assessment in the first place. So helping to simplify the process of gathering all the information you need in order to set up an assessment at the very beginning.
Okay, so just pulling that together, as we sort of summarized there, adding machine learning to drive much more accurate prediction, and then using analysis specifically within video interviewing to drive automated scoring, and which can then be reviewed by recruiters to make the final decision, but add a lot of very rapid benefit to that process and make it a lot faster, save a lot of hours, are the two key areas where we are implementing AI for clients currently. at the high level, the point here is about how do we do this innovatively and responsibly at the same time. So in these two solutions that we've outlined, and more generally, making sure that assessment is inclusive and accurate is the key. As I emphasised earlier, the role of HR as guardian here and being clear what you want is really vital. But with the right approach, we're absolutely convinced there is a huge opportunity to improve assessment outcomes and deliver significant value from that, both in terms of accuracy, fairness, also for candidate experience by making assessments shorter and more relevant and more engaging, and finally, in terms of significant process efficiencies which drive better value for users. So we'll now stop at this point and are ready to take questions from the audience. Okay, so the first one we have here is a question about, with so many AI tools around, how do I know what's good and what isn't? Jared, would you like to start and I'll maybe add to that?
I think so. I mean, as with any sort of technology, there needs to be a very rigorous evaluation process and some rigorous due diligence done before you adopt it for something as important as the hiring process. I think one of the key things that we encourage our clients to look at is the team that's behind the technology. So it's very important to sort of evaluate who has built it. Is it just the technology department? Is it the technology department combined with some subject matter experts? That will make a very big difference, as we saw on that one slide about Amazon's HR tool, for example, in the quality of the output that's produced by any machine learning technology that you invest in. I think it's also important to investigate and do some deep diving into what the tool produces to help you understand how it came to the conclusions that it did. As Val was mentioning earlier, if you end up in front of an employment tribunal, you really do need to be able to explain how the machine came up with the scores that it did. And in fact, you need to be able to explain the whole pipeline of data input to scoring and how the life cycle of that happens as it's refined. If you've got anything, Al, that you want to add to that?
No, I think that's probably again the main point. I think is taking all that in mind and just being really clear about what outcomes you're trying to get to. I think it's probably quite helpful to reflect on if it went wrong, what would it look like? So you're really clear what you're trying to avoid, as well as what perfect would look like. I think if you can articulate that, you can get to a good answer very easily when looking at any tool actually about how impactful in a helpful way it would be, what the risk of failure looks like, but also how will it fit in and integrate into what you're doing in a comprehensive way. Yeah. So a second one here is about, okay, our data is in different systems. Where should we start? I think that's a good, a very common occurrence, and entirely makes sense. So yes, often data is in different systems. So there is a piece there about integration. I think there is, which with other HR systems, which for any tool that you're looking at, I think is quite key that it's able to connect to other HR systems. I think also the point there within the assessment space is data is often very fragmented. I think step one is it in a system in the first place? One of the worst sort of offenders for this is the final assessment activities, which are often even done on paper. And I'm talking about interviews, the assessment centres and that kind of piece, or in a spreadsheet somewhere. The problem with it being in a spreadsheet somewhere is it's not online and accessible via an API to be linked to anything. So I think that's a bit of a baseline for different data points to be usable. And so the key here really is, can you join that data up? And that's probably the first question to ask, I think. If it can be joined up and looked at in its entirety, then you can really get value from it. If it's kind of hidden in a silo and you can't, that's a barrier that will need to be addressed first. It's entirely solvable question, but it's probably the first question to address. Yeah. Okay, so we have a question here about the video transcribing. and I'll let Jared just speak to this because of the languages piece. So is this only for UK English, or what other languages can it apply to, and how does it discriminate, or does it discriminate in terms of language capability and first or second language?
That is actually a very good question. We've certainly seen with video analysis that there is a lot of bias and discrimination. The people who have been creating the technology in video analysis are primarily based in Silicon Valley, and therefore their sample set for training is very often white men, to put it bluntly, and it tends not to do very well on anyone else. For transcribing, there are a number of languages that are supported, with more being rolled out all the time. Our tool supports 5 languages, but 3 sort of dialects, if you like, of English. So it supports, for example, US English, UK English, and sort of internationalized English, if you like, along with Spanish, Korean, and Chinese. Yes. So it is a tool that cannot support every language on the planet yet. It is a tool that does manage to handle people whose language is not English, and obviously the technology is constantly improving there as well.
Yeah, and to the second, and on that point, because some of the input tools to this are Amazon Web Services hosted tools, it's their generic transcription capability that's being rolled out across by lots of businesses internationally is what we're drawing upon. So that's being very rapidly expanded. So it's probably one of the fastest moving kind of tools on that perspective. To the question about discrimination, specifically on this, that's why the text analysis piece is really key. One of the areas that we're focused on in one of the organisations we're working with, one of the high street banks in the UK, we're looking at the modelling of that and making sure that the diversity aspects are baked into the model so that we can demonstrate the fairness consistently. And from our perspective, we believe that's sort of an absolute must-have. In the text analysis piece is the least likely to create discrimination. Interestingly, to the point that there are some partners we work with who are really interested in using it, where they want to do video interviewing but never look at the videos, because they know that recruiters looking at the videos is a potential source of bias. So actually use it as almost a kind of blind interviewing tool in order to remove bias. So I think that's where the real opportunity is on that one. There's another question here about the inclusion of neurodiversity, and just to quote the question, HR do not have the knowledge of creating a fair and equal assessment at present. How are we going to include this highly intelligent population? And so to this point, I was at a event around neurodiversity recently on a panel with a part of the company, Auticon, who focus on placing autistic candidates mainly into IT and consultancy roles. And in that discussion, I think there are a number of points raised that speak to this. The first one actually is a much more fundamental one from an HR perspective about how you design the job in the first place. Because currently, most jobs are designed in quite a generic way with quite a broad set of competencies, for example, some of which, for example, a autistic candidate, for example, going for a cybersecurity role might be brilliant at a number of the areas, but then find some of them very uncomfortable. Some of the analytical, pattern finding aspects of that role, we may have a candidate who will be absolutely fantastic at that, or data scientist, for example. But equally, some of the social interaction aspects, which are generically expected of all jobs, are effectively an accommodation we probably need to make for that candidate to be successful. Yeah. So defining what the job could look like and being open-minded about that is critical, because if you're trying to assess a neurodiverse candidate who's got great potential in certain areas against a very generic, typical set of competencies, you are making it really difficult from the start to do it well. When it then comes on to assessment techniques, there is plenty of space for the right kind of cognitive assessment. There's also a lot of space for good task-based assessment, and I mean by that, for example, work sample assessment exercises. They can be really effective in a fair way. The worst culprit, interestingly, is the interview. So, you know, classic interviews are very biased because of all of the social aspects to them towards people who are good at and really comfortable with interacting socially. They don't really probe as well onto actually like hardcore problem solving skills or more internal capabilities. So reviewing the process from that perspective is key. I'm very happy to pick that topic up in more detail afterwards if that's of interest to the individual that raised that question, and we've got some more to share on that. But at a high level, that would be the key points I'd make. So we have a question here about, can cognitive performance be predicted using behavioural, attitudinal and demographic data? The short answer to that is to a limited degree. If cognitive performance is important in a role, there may be a sort of question within that about how it's measured. So there are more traditional ways of doing that, using numerical verbal reasoning, for example, but there are also much more immersive ways of doing that, for example, using more industry-specific exercises and case studies, which make that a more realistic experience. So I would probably mainly towards that second point, if there are issues about the sort of typical way of doing it. There are correlations with behaviour and attitudinal elements, but I think we need to be careful that they are correlations and not causal, and therefore they can be part of our modelling. But you know, we shouldn't shy away from looking at cognitive ability, but in the mix of a whole person assessment. Okay, so we have a question here. What data do you require from firms that want to use your services? If you wanted, for example, to hire a head of marketing, what inputs do you need to put into your service? So briefly on that point, in a higher volume process, typically there will be some role analysis which will involve a fair bit of stakeholder input. At high volume, that makes lots of sense because there's enough sort of volume of people going to be going through to justify that. When it comes to more individual roles, the way that we do that is looking at what are the key competencies needed for the role. So let's say it's head of marketing, from a bank of capabilities, and then also looking at from that what we know about the existing people that we have assessment data on in terms of fairness and validity to define what should go into an assessment. So we have a mechanism for defining that. As Jarrett also mentioned, we're starting to apply AI to make that even faster, but we have a way of basically looking at what the key capabilities are and driving it from that. Okay, I believe that that's it for now on questions. So I'd just like to say to everybody who joined, thank you very much for joining. I hope you all found that informative, and we look forward to connecting in the future if there are any follow-up questions. Thank you very much. Good morning. Bye-bye.